Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be tuning in from. Welcome to episode 99 of our LinkedIn live stream series we've been doing now over the last couple of years. Jason's out today. I'm joined by Brad Linch. Brad is one of our top SEs and now manager of our system engineering group. And we're both located in Colorado, but he is already out at our Veeam Tech Expo in Austin, Texas, because it wasn't warm enough in Colorado for Brad, so he had to go seek someplace a little toastier. Welcome aboard, Brad.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Really happy to be here for the second time and be part of this ransomware series and a particular topic of the ransomware piece that Veeam covers. That's pretty close to near and dear to my heart here. So appreciate you having me.
Yeah, no, thanks for joining us again. And, we thought it would be good as we kind of wind down our multi-part ransomware series and just talk a little bit Veeam specifics, although some of these things certainly apply to any backup and recovery solution you may use. Before we jump in, though, want to encourage everyone, give a message or a shout out where you might be tuning in from. We've already got a few people that have come in from California to India to I'm in Colorado, as I mentioned, and then Brad's in Texas. We've got production over in Georgia, United States, and let's see, my geography is failing me. We've got another country over there as well. So thanks for that. We'll get back and check on this in a couple different times throughout our segment here. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to jump in with that. I do want to mention that we'll be putting a URL for our ransomware trends report a couple of different times during our live stream. If you're not familiar with that, there you can see VEE.am/RW22. That just means ransomware 22. Jason and I have been referring to that over past number of episodes. It is an independent report. It's not Veeam specific whatsoever. And it actually interviews and details the responses from 1,000 organizations globally that did get attacked by ransomware. And they offer some of the statistics, the trends, and things that came out of that. So if you're looking for air cover to take to your boss about, is this real? Can this really happen? Brad, it really does happen, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And probably one of the most important piece of the approach of your ransomware strategy is actually having a backup that's recoverable, right? There's many pieces to the forensics and testing the verification and the rapid recovery piece, which I would maybe argue is the second most important thing. But you know, as you know, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that immutability, that having a safe copy. So I'm excited for that.
Yeah, if we tee up our first slide, kind of want to frame this a little bit. There's a lot of different things going on in here, and actually, this is not exhaustive even, but within the Veeam portfolio, that's what's on the left-hand side, Veeam Backup and Replication, our monitoring and analytics tool, Veeam One, our disaster recovery orchestration solution, and our Kasten product, K10, that focuses on Kubernetes. Brad, our colleague now who's gone off to be an independent analyst, Melissa Palmer, she always likes to say that ransomware is a disaster. So all of these automation capabilities in Veeam 1 and Veeam Disaster Recovery Orchestrator play a role. On the right-hand side, there's kind of the two bits of the coin, like you mentioned, Brad. There's the backup side, there's the recovery side. While we're not going to double click on it, one of the ones I think is interesting is Secure Restore. If people aren't familiar with that, take us through what the concept behind Secure Restore is.
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. So, what's key here is once you actually have that immutable copy, is then the next phase is you want to most likely test those backups are actually usable, right? As that report and survey that you mentioned, Dave, it's very clear that ransomware can lie dormant for days, weeks, if not even months. So making sure that you're not just backing up dormant ransomware, you need to test those backups. So what Secure Restore does is it gives you the ability to mount those backups and test them with the AV tool of your choosing, really any antivirus tool that has a CLI interface that we can integrate with. And you could automate this, right? You could have this occur after each backup. You could have it occur weekly, quarterly, whatever makes sense to your business. And it'll mount that backup, run the AV scan, and email you a report of, if we found anything that may have been malicious, or if everything looks good, just essentially a green thumbs up. And now you can have a little extra comfort, security, insurance in knowing that if you are hit by a ransomware attack, that you have a copy that's recoverable, which is really key. And just kind of one extra note that is probably most important, and of course it's a biased opinion based on the company I work for, but where Veeam can really stand out in the industry is that rapid, reliable recovery piece, right? Veeam offers the ability to recover off an all-flash array, off of a storage snapshot, off of a replica, right? A replica from backup, where essentially from an RTO perspective, you're talking about just powering on a VM. So your recovery could be seconds. So just that recovery piece, and that's kind of the elephant in the room and a lot of these conversations, Dave, is, we can move a copy to tape, we can move a copy to the cloud, but you get a notification that, hey, pay us X amount of Bitcoin to this account. And the CFO goes to the director of IT and says, hey, how fast can you bring up 1,000 VMs and 700 terabytes of data? And if your director of IT sees some of the data is in the cloud and, on the disk-based repository and on tape, and if his or her answer is, 2 or 3 days, and, that's $5 million, $10 million a day to the business to be down, plus the brand reputation associated with that, and the hackers are asking for a measly $1 million, the CFO might have a very easy decision on his or her hands. So that ability to recover quickly and the options that you have, I find is always that elephant in the room. Is like, hey, we can do everything we want here. We can do forensics, detection, we can do immutable air gap copies, but let's really make sure that you can actually recover this data in a SLA that meets the business needs.
Yeah, great point. And if we kind of think about the steps that are involved, one way to sort of triage this is a three-part approach, protecting with immutable backups. And we'll focus the balance of this conversation or this live stream predominantly on that. But there's also the detection, the monitoring side, and the testing and the verification along the lines of what you were mentioning there, Brad. And what I want to do, though, before we jump into the meat of things, let's go hit the world map again. I think we've got some activity, I'm told. Numerous people actually in California, very warm desert, American Southwest, someone says. Ohio, we've also got, and looking across the world, we've got the Czech Republic, Denmark, interestingly enough, Cayman Islands, which is, I don't know if we've had them before, Brazil, you can see here. And we've also got Morocco, Nigeria, Mozambique, one that we don't see a lot of. So welcome. Nigeria, we actually do see pretty frequently, and welcome Morocco. And then India and Pakistan as well. So really all corners of the globe. So thank you very much for tuning in, and keep your comments coming where you might be tuning in from. But as we kind of look at our best practices, this is an industry accepted term, meaning 3-2-1, which interestingly enough, our buddy Curtis Preston, who's over at Druva actually, but has been in the business a long time, and he likes to talk about the 3-2-1 rule. It actually came from digital photography, not just from the data center. But Brad, we added some extra digits here a couple of years ago at Veeam. That's why they're Veeam Green. Maybe for those that might not be familiar with it, if you could take us through and as a kind of a precursor to set you up, I always like to point out, and I'm curious your take on this, but the 3-2-1 aspects in my mind, I view those as minimum, meaning that it's not saying 3 copies and 4 are bad. In fact, I oftentimes make 5 copies of my data personally. So I view these as kind of minimum recommendations.
Absolutely, Dave. And right, there's really, and we're going to talk about this more, but there's really 2 scenarios when it comes to a hacker compromising your backups. Scenario 1 is they get into the Veeam server and start deleting backups. Scenario 2 is they actually get onto the repository server itself and start deleting or encrypting or essentially making these backup files useless. And that's where the addition of the 1 and the 0 come from, right? Making sure you actually have a copy that's immutable, and making sure that, we touched on it and with the secure restore feature and the share backup features, making sure you're actually testing and verifying that those backups are actually usable and you're not just backing up dormant ransomware or encrypted files or things of that nature. So that's where really that additional 1 and 0 take place, because if you're not meeting that, you're really leaving yourself open to serious vulnerabilities in both scenarios, right? Where they log on to the Veeam console or the repository and they can willy-nilly start removing files, and we'll highlight going forward how 1 and 0 prevent that. I do kind of want to put it back on you, Dave, because a question I get asked almost, almost weekly when I'm talking to customers is, you know, air gapped and immutable. You hear those terms all the time, and what are the differences? Is there a difference? And I'm curious what your take on that is.
Yeah, I kind of view it as a continuum. Generally, at Veeam, we're kind of operating under the assumption that they're fairly interchangeable, meaning air gap and immutability. If you want to put a closer lens on it, you could argue to be truly air gapped, something like tape, or in my case, I do use an ejected drive. Once my nightly Veeam backup is done, it logically ejects a USB-C attached SSD drive or flash drive from my system. So it's physically still there, but the literally the volume manager cannot see the drive. So from a hacker perspective, it is air gapped. But I generally think of them pretty much the same. If you want to try to, really zoom in, you could make the case that to be air gapped, there should be some kind of logical or ideally even physical separation between the media where you've written to and what you can get access to. But the point is just trying to put up a better perimeter so that you can't, run unencumbered and go and attack. And I was actually, a little bit of nerd humor. Our buddy Anthony Spiteri turned me on to a podcast series I listened to 3 episodes yesterday as I walked around. The podcast is called Darknet Diaries. And the one episode I listened to was detailing the Saudi Aramco hack that's believed to be the biggest hack or the most destructive ransomware event in history to this point. They had an enormously flat network. And what that basically meant is once the bad actors got in, they could run unabated. There were no kind of bulkheaded off areas. So here's a clear case besides proper zoning and other kinds of capabilities. If they did have immutable copies of their data, it located really at any point, they would have been so much better off because literally 85% of their systems were taken out in one foul swoop.
Wow, wow, that's a crazy story. Yeah, and to build off that just a tad, right, is that's where that elephant in the room comes into play in these conversations, really around that air gapped and immutable conversation, right? And it's not that I'm totally for an air gapped solution. Just make sure and ask yourself the question, hey, if air gapped, it's air gapped or nothing to your business, make sure that it's actually recoverable in a timely manner. Because if it's not, and you're talking about tape, which tape is great, it's making a comeback, but if it's not going to meet the RTOs that the business need in a true attack, then you might need to rethink the solution that you're architecting, right? So, that's all I just kind of want to add to that piece.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And if we kind of zoom in now a little bit from a Veeam perspective, again, these can conceptually apply to any backup recovery software. But Veeam very much like to promote a notion of flexibility, meaning not dictate the infrastructure. So we look at a policy here from a backup perspective or secondary copy perspective of 3 different tiers. I got a performance tier where data first lands, and that could be comprised of a variety of different sources: direct attach, network attached file share, deduplication appliances, or something that we introduced a while ago called our hardened Linux repository. And let's build out the rest of the tiers here, Brad. Hardened Linux repository or hardened repository, we've got the lock symbol associated with that. Maybe just comment a little bit about what's going on with the hardened Linux repository from a Veeam backup perspective.
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. So, this is something Veeam came out with a little while ago, and this offers the capability to back up to any type of Linux repository and harden it. And what that means is when you back up to a Linux repository, we mark those files as immutable. So I described kind of 2 scenarios earlier, right? Scenario 1, the hacker gets into the Veeam server, gets excited, starts deleting everything. Well, as we'll show in a little bit, they would get an access denied error. It would say, hey, you mark these files as immutable for 30 days, whatever, insert whatever amount of days you want. and we can't remove those files until that expiration date hits. And furthermore, scenario two, right? Scenario two is they actually log on to the Linux box itself. And what's so important about this functionality is that we have the concept of a single-use credential. So when you add this server to Veeam, we don't store those credentials anywhere. It's gone. And I don't want to call it a paranoia, but if you want to take an extra healthy paranoid step, you could disable SSH after that. So now you're talking about a scenario where somebody needs to physically access this box to go and delete files. So you're talking about a very grand scheme where a hacker's probably social engineered his or her way into your data center. So this is a very nice secure option we want. And to your point, Dave, version 12, we're only going to add more options here with integrations with HP Store Once immutability. So that on-prem repository that you're backing up to, you'll have additional options in terms of a first tier immutable backup.
Great explanation. And yeah, we'll double click a little bit more on actually see the hard Linux repository in action, but building out the rest of the tiers as we go from left to right. So then in the middle, we've got a capacity tier where things can either be written to immediately or age out over time. Multiple different options there, from different object storage targets, public cloud targets, obviously private cloud. And today, offering immutability around Amazon S3, all S3 compatible solutions that support this same object locked construct. And since we did mention version 12, meaning the next release of Veeam that will be coming out, we're going to have support for Microsoft Azure immutability as well. So we'll be actually adding a third lock, if you will, in the capacity tier. And then the archive tier going off to colder storage. And I'm not pictured here, but Brad, you did mention it earlier, certainly physical tape support as well, which truly is, like you say, making a comeback. It may not be your recovery of first resort, but especially if you've already made investments in physical tape, LTO9 and that generation, approximately around there, is a very affordable, very good recovery of last resort. And I wanted to give a little shout out, a lot of partners that we've got, but I'll mention Wasabi in the capacity tier, the archive tier, because we actually have an amazing number of petabytes, hundreds of petabytes with Wasabi, in addition to some of our other partners. So we talked about it earlier, but this is actually snippets of the Veeam backup and replication console. Maybe just walk us through again what you described verbally on the previous section.
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. Yeah, I might have led the witness a little bit too much on the previous one, but this really kind of zooms in a layer deeper on what we're talking about here, right? So as you can see here, you add in that Linux server, you give us the DNS or IP, and it's a single-use credential, meaning we only use that credential for that first add of the repository when we deploy our Veeam services, and then Veeam doesn't store it anywhere. It's a non-root account, and then furthermore, right, I call it a healthy paranoia. But if you really want to take that extra next step, you could disable SSH. You certainly don't have to. But once we install our services, you can disable SSH. And once again, right, you're talking about now the only way is for somebody to have physical access to this box to log on to the console and SSH into the box.
Yeah, and I love the part at the bottom there about XFS and utilizing the block cloning for additional speed. When I turned on actually XFS in my home lab, I could not believe the synthetic processing, how much that sped up.
Yep, absolutely. That's definitely a feature that should almost be a requirement. It's a huge space saver.
Yeah. So let's hit the map again if we could. I could see. Okay, yes, Florida has come in. We've got Mexico as well, and looks like Sweden, France, Netherlands, Portugal. Also got Peru and Chile. So quite a bit of South American sponsorship and attendance today. And then we've got Tunisia as well. So hitting many quarters of the globe. Thank you very much for that. Appreciate it. Keep the comments coming. So if we go back and just look at, to your point, I'll be the slide clicker and you do the talk track, because you mentioned we're going to actually, see what would happen if you
Yeah.
were to try to go delete something.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So just to go back to those two scenarios, right? So the two scenarios that a hacker is going to try to delete your backups in, one's that they log on to the actual Veeam console itself. So you can go ahead and click, Dave. Um, yeah, so right in this scenario, they come in, they go to your backups, and they actually start to try to delete files. Well, they would get this error that says, "Hey, unable to delete backups. You said that these should be immutable till X amount of days, and we won't delete them until then." So, uh, scenario one, they can't get into deleting your backups from the actual Veeam console itself. And then scenario two, if you go ahead and give us another click here, is now let's say somehow they try to log onto the console. Now, in theory, they wouldn't even see this because they can't SSH into the box, right? They can't get the credentials from Veeam. We don't store them anywhere. And so unless they're physically accessing your data center, they're not even going to get this. And even if they did, right, they would have had to get the credentials from somewhere, and it wouldn't have been from Veeam. But in the case where they actually do log on, they would see this I associated with backup files. So for anybody familiar with Veeam, VBKs, VIBs, VBMs, those are our backup file types. And these backup file types are locked. They have an I immutability flag associated with them, and they're unable to delete until that actual expiration date hits. So just kind of, Dave and I are just really double reinforcing the point here and zooming in a layer deeper that from kind of both scenarios, you have a very nice level of protection here.
Yeah. Yep. Perfect. And if we kind of look to see this in action, what you see there in the middle is the operation did indeed fail. It's flagged as an immutable backup. This is if you're not familiar with it, the Veeam console, and the status steps are showing that there indeed could not go and delete anything before its designated amount of retention has been met.
Yeah, well, and just a quick add there, Dave, is that now this is actually that object storage repository, right? This is AWS, Wasabi, Azure Blob in version 12. Just to give a little shout out, there's a lot of on-prem S3 vendors. So EMC ECS, I think, is actually second or third in terms of amount of data that's stored, because a lot of our, Fortune 100 companies are big, can be big Dell shops, so they have EMC ECS. But the point that this is highlighting is now, okay, we can't delete your Linux on-prem repository. Let's go try to delete your backups located in object storage, and they get the same error. And furthermore, if they were to log onto your AWS console or your whatever S3 provider you use, that console, it would be a similar access denied error. So just highlighting that both your on-prem and your offsite immutable copies, that the hacker or the bad actor in this scenario would get the same access denied regardless of where the backup file is located.
Great point there. If we just look ahead just a little bit now, mentioned flexibility a couple different times. The thing I always think is interesting, and our colleague Rick Vanover likes to say, Veeam operates from the basement lab all the way to the bank, the Fortune 100. And part of the reason for that is being software only can deploy in a number of different ways, but on a lot of different infrastructure. So storage agnosticism certainly comes into play here. That change of deployment, either as your business expands, or to your point earlier about when you really sit down and do a design tabletop exercise, do you actually have the ability to meet what your business requirements might be or have evolved to? And if not, then you can certainly reconfigure your deployment. And then, looking at from a scale perspective, we can definitely scale out the components that we need when we need to. I like to, Brad, sometimes, make the point that the version of Veeam that runs on my Lenovo laptop is the exact same binary that runs at a major bank protecting 8 petabytes of data. The difference, of course, is they're protecting 20,000 machines with heavyweight infrastructure as compared to the resources that my laptop may have. And then the last piece here, I'll let you take this one, but tell us in the field perspective about this notion of number 3 future proofing.
Yeah, absolutely, right. So I mean, out there, everybody's signing, 1 or 3 year, occasionally a 5-year contract. And, you know, for the most part, it's very rare I meet a customer who's used the same vendor, software, hardware, data protection, storage, whatever it might be, servers. They've used the same vendor for 10, 20 years, right? Things evolve, budgets change, requirements change, SLAs change. So, what's really key about this is Veeam being software only and having integrations with dozens of different vendors is there's no lock-in into a specific storage vendor, server vendor, whatever it might be. So it just gives you a lot of flexibility in that point, and really all three of these bullets right here, Dave. I mean, this is where, once again, bias, but this is where I find that Veeam sets it apart. It's always a balance of when folks are putting together their ransomware defense strategy. It's this balance of kind of budget and speed. And from a Veeam perspective, if you kind of have an open checkbook, I mean, we can give you recovery options that are out of this world in terms of having compute and data store space in another data center and have a replica ready to turn on if you're treating ransomware as if it's a tier 1 DR, which budget's really key, and you're trying to put together a solution on a budget. We can easily integrate with LTO9, as you mentioned, with tape, and have offsite copies ready to go. So these three bullets are really near and dear to Veeam's heart, in that it's very simple to architect and design a solution to meet the needs of both that budget and speed to find the right balance for a business. So yeah.
Great point. Great point. Oh, I see you've got a comment from Joe. Joe says, as an IRIX administrator, I'm happy to see XFS is still in use. I've used it since it was, quote, invented. So IRIX, you don't hear about that operating system every day of the week, at least in my world or circles. So thanks for that comment, Joe. And as we wrap up, just want to put this back up. We touched upon but a few of the capabilities. We obviously wanted to pick a couple of the most impactful ones and make the point that there's really flexibility in how you deploy that. So Brad, super shout out. Thanks for coming back and joining us on the stream, and look forward to seeing you in Austin later today. And want to give a shout out to people to check out the Ransomware Trends Report. You can download that. 1,000 organizations providing feedback of what they learned from attacks that hit their organization. And looking ahead, this Friday, 1 hour earlier than what we went on air today with, meaning if you're on U.S. East Coast, it would be 11 a.m. We're going to have a celebration for the 23rd annual SysAdmin Day. And our colleague, Rick Vanover from Veeam, of course, and one of our great partners, Opti9, Siggy Brody, the Chief Technology Officer there. Rick and Siggy are going to be on streaming, and they're going to have a lot of tech prizes that they're giving away. And then 1 week from today will be episode 100 of our live stream here that we're doing on Mondays. We're going to have, for the first time, I believe first time, and correct me, production team, if I'm off on that, but we've not ever had our Chief Technology Officer from Veeam, Danny Allen, attend. So Brad, we've had you on twice because we value, your opinion, but we figured we better kind of mix it up and bring in our boss too, and let him do a little bit of visiting. So be sure to check that out. Thank you very much, Brad. I really appreciate you jumping in and taking us through and bringing the real world perspective to this.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited for folks who get to tune in next week with Danny. Be very insightful.
Yeah, really. No, all seriousness, it really is. Thanks everyone globally for tuning in. Stay safe, stay positive, and we'll see you on the next live stream.